The monster released its hand. It landed on the floor. The golem began to crumble into pieces. The tired boy fell out of it and said that judging by Arthur's expression, he could not scare him, but he was able to surprise him. Winsome pointed at Arthur and said that he wanted to introduce him to Ren and that he would be his instructor for quite a long time, so they should get along. Arthur bowed low and said that he was pleased to meet him and that he would rely on his instructions. The instructor turned to Winsome and asked what kind of punishment was used in human society for being late. Arthur raised his eyebrows in surprise and asked him what that meant. The instructor replied that he should probably cut off a finger or toe, but that sounded kind of cruel, and he probably just needed to be isolated or jailed. Arthur shook his head in surprise, not understanding what they were talking about, because it was all too ridiculous and the consequences of being late. The blonde looked at the instructor and said that it was not welcome and people really didn't have some kind of cruel punishment for being late. Ren was surprised by that. He touched his chin, looked away and called it strange, then said that given their insignificant lifespans, it seemed to him that time was a much more important resource for them. He approached his student and said that the human race was very backward. Arthur mentally confirmed his words. The instructor turned around, hitting the guy with his cloak and said that despite his ignorance, they should get to the point of why they had gathered and why they had come to this godforsaken crater on top of a mountain. He crossed his arms, looked at Arthur and said that he should undress. Arthur was stunned by what he had just heard. He grabbed his clothes, agreeing with this. Arthur stood before the instructor in his underwear. He asked if he should stop there or if the man wanted to see something more. The brunette poked him in the chest and said that the supposed savior of the lower races was quite talkative. What if he noticed something? The man noticed a feather tied around Arthur's arm. He quickly grabbed it. Arthur weirdly extended his hand in front of him. The man looked ahead and said that it was too rare a material to be used simply as a hand warmer. Winsome looked at Arthur, who didn't understand these words, and explained that the feathers on their wings are a special type of scale that has unique properties that are inherent to both mana and ether. The instructor returned the feather to Arthur and said that from the day they are born, they never shed their wing feathers. So if a dragon deliberately gives its first to someone, it means that it completely trusts and respects the person. Arthur remembered how Sylvia gave him the first one and said with a smile that he didn't even know that. Ren tugged his hand and said that it was time for them to stop talking, then asked Arthur to spread his arms. Arthur spread his arms to the sides. The man looked at him from all sides, taking measurements. The instructor clapped his hands, looked at him and said that it was time to start with the basic spells of all the elements under his control and that Arthur should only use his right hand, after which he said that he needed to summon a stone column 2.5 meters high and 20 centimeters in radius. Arthur did not have time to understand what was said. He hastily created a column, hearing the words that they did not have time for questions. Ren thoughtfully examined the vortex of air in Arthur's hand. The young man created fireballs flying around him. Then he created several streams of water. Ice spikes appeared from under Arthur's feet. Arthur put his hand in front of him and created red lightning. The sun was setting behind the ledge of the canyon. The man said that the basic measurements and calculations were complete. He snapped his finger, looked at Arthur and said that it was time for them to move on to the effective use of mana in battle. A huge golem walked towards them. The man pointed his hand at it and told Arthur to shoot a spell at the enemy. Arthur put his hand out and created a powerful electric discharge. The golem jumped back from the attack. Arthur prepared another blow. Another monster approached Arthur from behind. It knocked Arthur down. The professor looked at the lightning that flew to the sky and said that Arthur missed. Arthur got up from the floor and said that, apparently, the man is a bad person. He touched his head in irritation and said that it would be easier for him to interact with the professor if he understood what he was trying to find out with all these measurements and observations, because they seem a little biased. Rem looked at him tiredly. The guy extended his hand and said that over the years of life he found out that the most convenient elements are fire and water. But in this place there is not enough mana for the water element. The man said that he will take this into account in the calculations. After which he asked how old the guy was. Arthur answered that he was almost 15. Ren touched his chin and said that perhaps the guy is not so brainless. He folded his arms, turned away and said that they need more tests, so they will continue to analyze the control of mana at a long distance. Arthur looked at the blonde with irritation. Suddenly, the ground beneath him trembled. New golems appeared on the ledge above them. Monsters began to descend down the walls. The guy looked at them and asked the instructor about how many golems he can summon at a time. Ren answered that it depends on their development, but like these, he can create around several thousand. The man raised his hand and ordered Arthur to give it his all. Arthur took the form of the heart of the world, surrounded by mana of different elements. Arthur rushed into battle with the golems. He swung his hand, approaching the stone blocks. He broke it into many fragments with one blow. Activating ice magic, Arthur neutralized the other two golems. The young man sternly stepped onto the sand, descending from the dead golems. He deactivated his form, wiped his chin and asked what would happen next. The instructor smiled and said that now he needed to learn more about his physical abilities. Arthur hugged his body and shivered from the cold. The man added that, according to Winsome, Arthur was quite skilled with a sword, and recently, under the guidance of Cordry, he was trained in close combat. Arthur agreed with this and asked how long he would be naked. The instructor looked at him with displeasure and said that he analyzes every movement of the guy's body, so it would be better if he was naked, but the young man did not worry because he did not enjoy it either. He flicked the guy and asked him to show the main weapon that he uses in battle. Arthur raised his hand, and Oris swirled around it. The guy grabbed his sword. The instructor raised his eyebrows in surprise. He took it in his hands. Suddenly, the man puffed out his cheeks with laughter. He raised his head and laughed hard. The guy said that it was not as easy as it seemed. Arthur held out his hand and asked to show it in action. The instructor said that he knew what it was. He turned to the blonde and asked if he knew about it when he asked to train him. The man replied that he guessed. Ren took the sword with both hands. The guy shook his head and said that he would not be able to open it, because only he could. Suddenly, he heard the grinding of the blade. The instructor pulled the sword out of its sheath and looked at it with a smile. He twirled the blade behind his back. Arthur asked in surprise how he managed to do it, and if it was because he was a Sirah. The man made a couple of moves, pointed the blade at Arthur and said that it was not so. He smiled contentedly and added that it only worked because he created this sword himself. Arthur remembered how, as a boy, he first opened this blade. Arthur looked at the blade in surprise. On the blade was carved the inscription, Dawn's Ballad WKIV. Arthur raised his eyebrows in surprise and asked if the man really created this sword. He grabbed his head. Hearing the instructor confirm, Arthur said that he could assume that the instructor really forged this sword, after which he asked him about what the blade was doing on the continent. Ren waved the sword and said that the blade was one of his experiments, and to some extent turned out to be a failure. The man remembered leaving the blade stuck in the ground and said that he had thrown it away in the animal fields the last time he had collected minerals there, expecting that no one would see it as more than a stick, much less that anyone would be able to pull the blade out. He frowned slightly and added that it was very surprising to him that the blade had somehow ended up in his possession since the chances of that happening were very slim. The young man frowned slightly. He looked at the instructor, who was muttering something under his breath, confused. Arthur extended his hand and asked if he really thought the blade was a failure since he had never come across a sword of better quality in his life. The man pulled the blade aside, frowned and said that no matter how flattering his words were, he found it offensive to compare his weapon, no matter how poorly made, to the primitive tools used by his race. Arthur frowned in surprise. The man bent the blade and said that he had tried to make the sword a universal weapon. And apparently, during the drinking session, this idea seemed good, but in the end it turned out to be just a sharp tool, nothing more. He looked back at the blonde and said that now he was interested. Winsome said that he had counted on it, and then asked what the instructor thought about seeing the guy and whether he would fulfill his request. The young man raised an eyebrow in confusion and asked what was going on. The blonde looked at him and explained that he had brought Arthur there for two reasons. Firstly, as he had already mentioned, although his methods were unconventional, Ren had an unusual sensitivity when it came to the practical application of martial arts, and secondly, he hoped that the instructor would create a smaller one that would better suit Arthur's unique fighting style. Arthur was stunned by what he had heard. He suddenly came to his senses and asked if it was true that Ren would forge a sword for him. The man replied that he did not forge balls, but created them. He put the blade in its sheath and added that for now he had only agreed to train him, since he owed a favor to the Lord. But his request did not extend to his free time, and he was not obliged to spend it on creating a sword for a creature of a lower race. The man put the blade on his shoulder and said that he would keep it for a while. Arthur did not understand his words and asked if he would return the blade to him. Ren leaned slightly and said that the sword may be just a sharp tool, but he still chose it as a master, and although he is not proud of it, he does not intend to take it away either. The man raised his hand, embraced by the aura. Suddenly, a depression appeared in the ground under him. A stone blade flew out of the appeared depression right into the instructor's hand. The man threw the sword to the guy and said that he would train with it and that he created it so that the sword can measure the user's movements and the strength of the blow. The young man made a couple of lunges and strikes. The instructor frowned slightly, hearing the question of whether he could just pull the sword out of the ground, after which he replied that he could do it from any material made by him. Arthur recoiled in surprise. The man extended his hand to him and said that he would also keep the dragon feather for himself. The young man asked why he needed it. The instructor touched his face with displeasure and asked why he didn't trust his every word, then said that Arthur should just give it to him. The young man looked at the tied feather. He carefully took it. Arthur placed the feather on the instructor's hand. The man put the item in his clothes and said that now that he was informed that the lower rays needed more time to sleep than them, Arthur could rest. Arthur asked him if they would spend the night in the center of a lifeless crater. The man looked back at him with a smile and asked what he hadn't said about both of them. The guy frowned in surprise. The man said that he and the blonde had business, and besides, during the war he wouldn't always have a comfortable bed waiting for him, so it was for his own good. Winsome also looked back and told Arthur to try to get some rest. The instructor wished him good night. The portal in front of Arthur immediately closed. Arthur closed his eyes and began to resent his words. Meteors were flying in the sky above the crater. The guy had built himself a small dwelling. He was sleeping peacefully inside. Suddenly, he opened his eyes. The guy quickly jumped up, hitting his forehead against a stone wall. Arthur grabbed his head in pain. He dismantled his dwelling. Arthur tied his hair in a ponytail. Suddenly, he heard the grinding of stones. Golems began to appear from all sides. The guy dodged their attack. The monster swung his axe. The guy looked back at the flying stones. Arthur created a stone formation, blocking the attack. He brought his hand to his mouth, covering himself from the dust and debris. Arthur stood in front of his opponents. Rem appeared on the edge of the crater and said that in the middle of a war he would never have the opportunity to rest well, so he needed to get used to fighting effectively. The man smiled and added that it was time for him to undress again and continue the battle. The guy exhaled in displeasure. The young man took off his clothes and activated the heart of the world. He attacked the golems with an air spell. One of the opponents climbed onto a ledge and sent an army into battle. The man said that the goal of the battle was to defeat the generals with a crown on their heads. The young man cut the body of one of the golems. The monster aimed a spear at his back. Arthur turned around, made a sweeping blow and parried the attack. The golem with a shield was quickly rushing towards Arthur. The young man raised his hand and created a magical charge. It attacked the shield and split it into many pieces. The golem was thrown back several meters after a strong attack. One of the opponents swung a stone axe. The allied golem saved Arthur with its count. The light golem swung its axe behind the enemy's back. It cut his back with one blow. The man said that Arthur would have allies on the battlefield. The young man rushed forward at high speed. The instructor called him one of the main players in this battle. Arthur frowned. Energy gathering around his hands, the man added that it would be up to him to go on the offensive. Arthur made several dashes, destroying the golems. He cut down the next enemy. The man said that he would always have a choice between breaking through the enemy. The enemy golem killed an ally behind him. The man added that the second option for him would be to stay with the team to keep them alive. Arthur quickly turned around, frowning. He plunged his blade into the golem's chest. The young man fell to the ground exhausted and said that it was hard. The instructor went down to him. He said that the total number of casualties on his side was 20-71, while the enemy's losses were 50-20, and considering the low level of the enemy v golems, this is not the most impressive victory. The man showed him a tablet with an account and said that he let too many allies die. The young man rose from the ground and said that it was because they looked like stone gorillas. The guy looked at the water and sandwich handed to him with great joy. He began to eat with great greed. The man wrote something down on his tablet. Arthur wiped his lips and said that he did not feel empathy for them, no matter whether they were for him or not. The instructor turned to him and said that the signs were just information, and now he would go to bed, after which he warned the guy and said that tomorrow would not be any easier. The young man fell to the ground. He slowly began to fall asleep. The guy closed his eyes. Suddenly he heard an unknown sound and quickly opened his eyelids. He grabbed the sword and rose to his feet. The next second, the guy frowned tensely. He noticed a black horn. The enemy was wearing dark armor. The monster was smiling maliciously. He was holding Tesha in his hands. The monster, standing on the ledge, was holding the girl by the throat. He smiled maniacally and squeezed his hand. The guy looked at her in fear, saying the girl's name. The elf began to get out, asking for help. The monster squeezed her neck again. Arthur looked at him with a maddened look. The symbols of the second stage appeared on his face. The guy activated the static void. Energy particles in Italy around him. The young man rushed into battle. He approached the monster and swung his blade. The next second, the opponent's hand was cut off. The girl began to fall. She fell to the ground. The guy again prepared to attack. He frowned sternly, holding the sword behind him. Arthur made a sweeping blow. The enemy dodged it, making a dash back. The monster slid along the ground. The wound on his hand began to tighten, and suddenly the severed limb rejoined his body. The monster spread his arms to the sides and created magical projectiles. The guy's body was covered in a dark aura. The young man swung his blade and reflected each attack. One of the projectiles flew around him, aiming at the elf. Arthur dropped his weapon and grabbed the scarlet projectile, blood spurting from his palms. The young man dropped his feet to the ground and redirected the attack. He touched the ground with his hand. The projectile hit the rock, creating a powerful explosion. The monster approached Arthur's sword. The young man looked at his opponent. He lowered his head and thought that this had gone too far. Arthur bit his lip. He waved his hand and called out to the instructor, saying that it was time to stop. The young man Selena frowned. The monster looked at him in surprise. The next second, the monster began to crumble. Arthur looked at the crumbling sand. Suddenly, the instructor appeared in the dust and said that Arthur understood everything pretty quickly, and he hoped that this illusion would last longer and he would be able to see how Arthur would deal with it. The young man grabbed his head, exhaled and said that in such an absurd situation it was difficult not to guess, so he hoped that this performance was not for fun. The man touched his chin and said that during training, there was no joking, and that perhaps, with the wrong training method, this was a disciplinary measure used by the lower races. Arthur replied negatively and said that it was just an expression. Ren took hold of his belt, waved his hand and said that they could forget about the guy's illogical behavior, because everything he did was for his own good, after which he said that he had spent most of his energy in reckless attempts to save this elf. The young man frowned in displeasure, saying that he himself understood that this was not the best decision. However, there were people who were more important to him than his own life. The man was silent for a second, frowning. He shook his head and replied that this was still a reckless waste of energy, although comrades and spouses were still important even for their race. The guy waved his hands in embarrassment and said that the girl was not his wife. The instructor said that given the blonde's words and the guy's reaction, he was sure that she meant more to him than just a lover. Arthur blushed with embarrassment. The man asked him if they had carnal pleasures. The guy answered with a scream that nothing like that had happened. He suddenly calmed down, covered his face with his hand and said that this was irrelevant, after which he asked if Ren could create a doll using only earth. The man snapped his fingers, and a throne appeared behind him. He said that he could create any scene on his own. The instructor sat down in a chair and said that he was still not omnipotent. For example, using only earth he could not imitate the properties of water. He looked at the guy and asked him how he understood that this was just a performance. Arthur remembered his opponent and said that as soon as he calmed down a little, he discovered fluctuations in the yellow mana particles of the earth around them. And although the dolls were extremely realistic, Basilisk had no reason to drag the girl to Ephianus. He raised one eyebrow and asked if the professor really believed that lower races were not given the ability to reach a level of understanding of mana comparable to his own. The man shook his head and said that it was not in his nature to consider something impossible, but he could call it unlikely, but the guy had nothing to worry about. Fluffy clouds floated across the sky. The young man asked him why he thought so. The instructor replied that the guy was just a walking collection of statistically unlikely things, because he had an innate ability to control all four elements, as well as some deviant forms. He showed 2 fingers, looked at the guy and said that this was perfect for revealing the secrets of the ether, which the dragon princess herself had kindly bestowed upon him. He frowned slightly and added that everything about him was out of place, because even the Azuras did not have such innate talent and luck. The guy smiled and said that if the man was trying to cheer him up like that, then it worked, and then asked about what was going on next according to the plan. The instructor grabbed his wrist and said that before further actions he wanted to examine his working hand. The man took out a stone crystal and said that it was called a chloride, and although in itself this is a rather rare but useless piece of rock, however, after proper cleaning and processing it is capable of something interesting. He smiled slightly, turned the guy's hand up and asked if the young man remembered that he said that he did not force, but created swords using this small stone and the right tools. In fact, he can grow weapons. The young man drew an analogy with a tree. Reincarnates hailed heavily and said that it was somewhat similar, but the process was completely different. However, if it would be easier for a lower race's brain to understand this way, let it remain unchanged. He pressed the stone into Arthur's hand. Smoke came out from his palm. The man said that under normal circumstances he would have spent years or even decades constantly analyzing his fighting style, and then would have fished out the necessary information in order to create a weapon that would perfectly suit him. However, due to the circumstances he would cheat a little and do the following. Arthur looked at him incomprehensibly. The man stuck the shard into his palm, thereby interrupting Arthur's question. Arthur grabbed his wrist, blood gushed from his hand. He asked the man about why he did not warn him, to which the instructor replied that he synthesized the stone using a feather and Sylvia scales, because both of these things are integral parts of his body. He flicked Arthur on the forehead and said that every movement, thought and measurement of his body would affect the shape of his weapon, so he was not even sure that it would appear at all. Arthur adjusted his hair, looked at his hand and asked why he did this if the outcome was not clear. The stone began to grow skin. Arthur added that it seemed to him that the man was not going to make a weapon for him. The instructor turned away and said that to deal with the Vritra clan, he would need something more than just a sharp stick, and besides, time was running out. Arthur frowned tensely and said that he thought he had about 2 more years until the expected start of the war. The man looked at him sternly and said that the blonde recently received a message from Alder with news from the continent. He looked down and said that he was saying this against the wishes of the Lord and Winsome, but he wanted the guy, knowing all the information, to make an informed decision. He said that the mineral was extremely unpredictable, because it could take a year or even 5, before it would prove itself as a weapon. The young man looked at him blankly. The man finished the sentence by saying that he still needed to become stronger for the war. The guy said that he already knew this and then asked him why the man was so impatient, even more than usual. He frowned suspiciously. The instructor grabbed his head and said that despite the fact that the army was still on the way. Arthur looked at him in shock, hearing the word that the war had already begun. He took a step forward and said that according to the blonde, he had 2 more years. The man shook his head and said that this was the essence of war because it was unpredictable. The guy turned around and said that in that case, he would return. He frowned deeply and added that if the war had already begun, he needed to fight. Suddenly, he froze in place. The young man looked down. His legs were grabbed by a stone golem. The man frowned angrily and walked towards him, asking if he was going to perish at the hands of the enemy. Arthur turned around and said that he had been training with the ethereal sphere for months, preparing to face them, and then asked if that was the whole point of his being in this place. Ren frowned. Arthur tensely lowered his gaze. The man said that it was not enough because in his current state, even a servant could easily defeat him. Arthur looked at him in surprise, hearing the 1-year limit. The man looked into his eyes and said that in 1 year, with his help, he could give the continent a chance to win. Arthur clenched his teeth hard. He frowned and nodded reluctantly. A cloud of dust spread across the quarry. Arthur's voice was heard from the crater. He agreed to 1 year. The floating island with the palace was illuminated by bright rays of the sun. Tesha frowned and told her grandfather that she could fight. The man looked at the sheets of paper and said that it was impossible. The man on the couch lowered his head and said that his grandfather was right. The girl looked back at him. The man said that at the moment it was too risky to bring her to the battlefield. Besides, there was no particular need for it. The princess turned around and asked him about how much longer they should wait until the risk of attack outweighed the risks associated with her appearance on the battlefield. Because they themselves said that she had become much stronger than before, the man replied that it was still not enough. The elf clenched her teeth. She turned to the exit and said that she was leaving. Frowning, she quickly walked past them. The door slammed loudly. Varian dropped his head heavily onto his hand. The man on the couch put his cup on the table. The old man asked if this was really the best solution. The interlocutor replied that Varian knew how much his granddaughter meant to Arthur. He saw his reflection in the liquid and said that no matter how many years the Suras would spend on his training, her presence on the battlefield would interfere with his decision. The girl walked down the corridor discontentedly. She looked angrily ahead. The princess was heading for the gates where the guards were standing. The soldiers noticed her. They blocked her entrance and asked what brought her. The girl with a calm expression asked them to open the door. One of the soldiers raised his hand and asked for forgiveness, after which he said that they had not received instructions from the commander or altar that anyone was allowed to leave the palace. The girl again asked to open the doors. Very approached her and said that the girl was on an assignment with her. The soldiers exchanged glances. They turned and stretched out their hands in front of them. The crystal on the gate began to shine. The girl nodded and thanked the men. A soldier in white robes met them. He looked at the girls, called them by name and asked about their destination. Very nodded to her ally. The elf looked at the man and asked to send them to Eddystone. The soldier bowed to them and let them through the gate. He raised his hands. The girls looked at him. The man said that due to the increased number outside and so, they should prepare the necessary means of identification before arriving. The elf looked at the girl and asked if she really wanted to babysit her. The general said that she had just finished a lesson with Princess Kathleen, so a short break would not hurt her. The girl smiled softly. She closed her eyes, her features obscured by a bright light. The girl imagined a map of the western part and thought about how the city had once been the capital of the human kingdom, and that she remembered how she had learned in school that this city had been built on the western shore of the continent, and thus, it was as far away as possible from the countries of the dwarves and elves as well as the animal fields. She imagined the entire continent and added that now, given the hell that was happening in the animal fields, this city had become the quietest and also ideal for defense, being surrounded by the ocean on 3 sides. People passed each other. The elf thought about how more than a year of war later, the king had destroyed the city and created from its ruins the last line of defense against the Alacrian army. Warm rays of the sun illuminated the city. A carriage drove through the streets, past people. Soldiers with swords talked to each other. Boys ran past the rows of walking soldiers. The girl paid attention to the gold stripes on the chests of the servants. The general looked at the elf and told her to always keep her sword ready. Tesha looked at her and said that the general was with her, and besides, this city was the farthest from all the battles. The girls went on. The general said that in wartime, you always need to be prepared for the worst. The elf noticed a tent with goods. She took out some objects from a chest and said that the general recently finished a lesson with the princess, after which she asked about how the twins are coping with their training. Very did not pay attention to her. The girl looked at the object in surprise. The general said that according to Barrow, the prince decided to stay in and is hard-working, but his progress is slow, despite the fact that he is a beast tamer, his understanding of mana is at best average. The girl smiled slightly and added that the princess, on the contrary, was doing well in her training, because she had been told that she had always stood out for her talent and now, after these 2 years, she understood why. She bought the goods from the old woman and was indignant at her words. The general turned to her and said that it was unlikely that anyone would be able to surpass her, but she periodically forgot that that boy was also their age, because Arthur was an anomaly of a completely different level. Tesha exhaled heavily. Very said that she could only imagine what he would become upon returning from the Azuras, and that she hoped that he would be prepared for service in the army. The elf noticed the soldiers and asked if the enemy army would be able to reach the city. She looked at her hands and added that according to the director, the enemy was to the west of the continent, but did this mean that Ediston was the closest city to their enemy? The general confirmed this and said that the director also mentioned the lack of effective means of transporting troops across the ocean. Kanna frowned and added that it meant that the enemy was thinking of a more reasonable method, such as going through the teleportation gates they had built throughout the beast fields. The girls passed under the arch, the general adding that Vritra would be able to carry a significant number of soldiers and hide them from reconnaissance in the endless labyrinth of tunnels and dungeons until they had accumulated the necessary strength for the attack. Tesha frowned slightly and thought that the information they knew about the enemy was mostly the director's words, and that Mr. Alder had weakened the curse that prevented her from giving out any information about her homeland, but she still fell into a coma. The girl looked up at the sky and added that because of the war, her relationship with her grandfather had become strained, but she was not the only one in confusion because he and the council were doing everything they could to support the people. Fluffy clouds floated above them. The princess added that after the death of the king and queen of Graysunders, the dwarves rebelled and the council had to establish relations with them from scratch while helping the cities prepare for war. She touched her chin. The stranger around the corner quickly ran towards her with a paper in her hand. The princess thought that even though her grandfather was constantly on edge because of all this, she had made good progress in her own development. Tesha turned to the running girl. She grabbed her weapon. Sheets of paper fell to the ground. The girl grabbed the handle. She knocked down the stranger and pointed the sword at her neck. Suddenly, the princess frowned in surprise. Emily looked at her in fear. Tears appeared in the girl's eyes. She smiled a little. Emily jumped up from the floor and reached out to hug the princess. The elf smiled contentedly. The girl hugged her. Emily looked at the general and greeted her. Very greeted her back. The princess knelt down and said she was glad to see her old friend. They started picking up the paper from the floor together. The elf apologized for what happened, explaining that the girl had jumped out of nowhere and her body had reacted automatically. Emily said that she should apologize to herself because she was carrying too much and her glasses were slipping down so she couldn't see where she was going. The girl smiled, adjusted her glasses and added that on top of everything else it was even funny in an absurd and scary way. Suddenly she jerked in fear and said she couldn't continue talking. Tessa took the remaining sheet and looked up at her friend. The girl trembled and said she needed to hurry. The princess stood up and asked what happened. Her friend replied that these were important papers that Gideon had requested from the copies and the council. The princess looked at the general. Very nodded calmly. Tessa smiled and offered to go with her. Doves flew over the city. Tessa looked at Emily. She nudged her with her shoulder and asked what she and the professor were working on now. The girl exhaled and said that she shouldn't call him professor. Her crazy master could hardly be called normal, let alone trusted to raise a new generation. She said that she swears that she can't tell you exactly how many times he had to be pulled out of a pile of rubble and useless trash that appeared after the explosion he created. She nudged the elf and asked how she was doing, how she spent the last few days. She replied that she hated being addressed as a princess. She pouted and said that she was doing just awful. She couldn't even imagine how stuffy it was in the castle. The inventor replied that for a castle there were rather narrow corridors and low ceilings. Emily said that she heard now is not the season for flying castles. The princess answered her did she really think she was the smartest? The girl sighed and told her to try spending a few hours a day with someone like a master. Then she would see what would happen to her sense of humor. The elf answered her to try sitting under house arrest in the palace with a Sura and an overbearing grandfather who shuddered with every breath. They both trembled. The girl adjusted her glasses and said not to be so strict with the Varian commander. She looked away and said that after that incident at the academy, she could only imagine how worried he and her parents must be. Tesha nodded and said that she knew and was trying. The past year had been hard for all of them. The only way she could convince herself that she was actually getting stronger was to train every day. She walked ahead and said that with the recent raids of Alacrian forces on the beast fields, she wanted to get to the battlefield sooner. Emily asked if there was any news about Arthur. The elf turned her head and asked what news besides the one that Mr. Alder was constantly repeating like a nervous bird mimic. The girls clutched the papers to themselves and quoted him that Arthur was working and that was all they needed to know. They laughed. Emily asked what about Elijah? There was silence. The silver-haired girl clutched the papers. She looked away and said that there was no news, so much time had passed and she still had no idea why he was taken alive. The green-haired girl looked at her as she said that all she knew was that he tried to save her and was captured. Their escort stopped and said that they were there. They stood in front of the doors. The party went down the stairs. Emily put her hands on the door and cast a spell. The passage lit up. Everyone went inside. The princess covered her nose and asked what was smelling there. The girl answered that there was a variety of smells there. In that room they melt and purify many different minerals and materials, so it is almost impossible to distinguish smells. The squad stopped when they heard someone asking how much more they should press into his stupid head that these minerals cannot be stored in one container. They draw out each other's useful properties, gradually turning into useless boulders. A worker ran out of the office. Emily said that she heard the voice of her dear master. The man looked at them. He bowed, greeted everyone and said that he was surprised that they returned so quickly. The master was expecting them. Emily asked if the master was in a bad mood again. Gideon appeared when the man was saying that the master was very excited waiting for these reports. The girl asked if he knew what they were about. The professor rustled papers. He threw them aside. Emily asked what happened. The man studied a notebook. He closed it abruptly, put it back in her hands. The brunette frowned. He pinched the bridge of his nose and cursed. The scientist looked away and turned to the general. He said that he had already submitted an official request to the council, but since he was already here, he thought it would be better if he went with him. The general looked at him and asked where. He replied that their path lay to the eastern shore, the northern border of the animal fields. A detachment of 5 people galloped. The princess held onto the elf's shoulder and wondered why the professor decided to leave in such a hurry. Gideon looked ahead and said that they had arrived. Everyone bragged abruptly. Tesha looked down with alarm and asked if it was the Dicathias. The scientist cleared his ear and said that they had been following him and were trying to force him to invent a way to travel across the ocean. He opened a map and said that the engine was powered not by mana, but by steam, which was obtained by burning certain materials. He remembered how they built this ship. The squad went to the ship. There was a hole in the bow. One of the wizards called off the water. Tesha looked at the man and said that it was not the Dicathias. He said that it was worse. The girl extended her hand and asked what did you mean worse? He said to move. Emily put her hand on her shoulder when she wondered if he was going to answer their questions at all. Everyone climbed onto the ship. The princess asked if it looked like teeth marks. The green-haired girl said that it was scary to imagine how big a monster could do something like that. Very said that there were no signs of life. The ship was empty. The elf took off her hood and thought if it really wasn't the Dicathias, then what? Everyone was climbing the stairs when she wondered who else but Gideon could have built this, and when he even set out to see and where the people were. She noticed something. She went to the general and called him. The elf turned around and said, everything was destroyed. Someone had deliberately erased the traces that showed the origin of this ship. The princess raised her hand and said that it looked like whoever was operating the ship didn't want anyone to know it was there. Emily came up and said that she wondered if the master's plans had leaked. Maybe one of his competitors or enemies had gotten their hands on them. The professor came up to them and said that it couldn't be. He grabbed his head and said that just a few weeks ago this ship had sunk into the ocean, and if it weren't for a group of adventurers who had stumbled upon it just at low tide, he would never have known about it. Emily looked at him and asked what about the ship's crew? Did he think they had all drowned? He replied that in that case there would have been some traces left. The man dropped to one knee and said there was no trace. No evidence. The crew certainly didn't want anyone to see the ship, let alone be on it. Veer looked at him and said she had a bad feeling about it the first time she saw it, but she would prefer to hear it confirmed. Gideon held out his hand and said that when he read the reply he prayed to all the gods that his fears were false, but apparently his prayers had not been answered. He took the papers and said that he thought perhaps the missing crew of the original Dicathias had managed to return unharmed. Everyone looked at him as he said that after careful examination he was certain that the ship was not the Dicathias and had never been. Emily looked at him and asked if that was what he meant. He interrupted and said that was exactly what he wanted. The fact that it existed changed the entire course of this war. Tesha frowned and asked what he meant by war. Everyone was tense. The professor raised his hand and said that it meant that the Alacrian arsenal had a way to build ships capable of transporting an entire division across the ocean to Dikatham. Varian stared at the device. He turned it off. The commander exhaled and thought that it seemed the situation was escalating much faster than they had expected. He wondered if they, as rulers, had had no time to prepare. The man slammed the table. He looked at the professor and asked if he was sure, and he confirmed that he was. Gideon frowned and said that while he only assumed the ship was built in Alacria, he was absolutely certain that the ship they had found was not the Diketheus. The queen placed her hand on her husband and asked how he could be so sure. The professor looked at everyone and said that he was proud to have created the Diketheus and wanted people to know whose hands had created it, so he had put his signatures all along the hull. He leaned over and said that he hadn't found any on that ship and that the materials used to create the frame were completely different. Blaine jumped up and the elf told him to calm down. The king looked at him and asked if he hadn't heard Gideon's report. He couldn't remain calm knowing that their enemy probably had a fleet of warships. The queen looked down when he said that their enemies had the ability to transport an army of hundreds and thousands of mage soldiers across the ocean. The elves frowned when he said that they were already having a hard time finding those bastards in the dungeons of the beast fields, and now, everyone looked at Alder when he had said enough. He folded his arms and asked Veer what she thought of the situation. The elf frowned and said that while she didn't have much knowledge of the Diketheus construction, she agreed with the inventor that the ship's lack of evidence spoke volumes. The brunette looked at her and asked if this was a trap, some strategy to split their forces and drive them deeper into the beast fields. Alder turned to her and said that if the Alacrians were trying to split their forces, it would be logical to leave the ship somewhere off the western shores to draw their attention to those areas. Muriel confirmed that given the frequent changes in water levels, it was a miracle they were able to find the ship. Alder tilted his head and said that Sylvie had thought that her people were trying to slowly move an entire army into the depths of the beast fields, but it would be foolish to assume that this was the only maneuver Vritra had attempted. Varian nodded when he said that all they could do was prepare for an attack from both sides, but given the dwarves' lack of leadership, they were short of warriors and mages. Blaine looked ahead, turned to the elves, and asked them to let him and Priscilla join them on their next trip to the Dwarven Kingdom they needed to fortify the city on the western bank. Varian frowned and said that he was right. If they were to win this war, they would need the dwarves' help. He put his head in his hands and thought that Alacria had had a way to transport people across the ocean all this time, and Tesha had gotten on one of their ships. He couldn't even be mad that Veer had let her join. Frankly, he was surprised that his granddaughter had spent so much time in the castle. There was a knock on his door. He allowed them to enter. Tesha opened the door and said that Veer had told him that he had called her. Grandfather activated the device and confirmed. He looked at the crystal and said he wanted to show her something. The hologram started. Tesha watched the footage in horror. On the battlefield, everyone was killing each other. A knight cut off his opponent's arm. Someone was riding a monster through fire. Varian said it was a real recording, made on the battlefield 5 days ago. A woman's head was cut off. He said that among the 400 people sent into that dungeon, in this one battle, they lost 200 warriors and 20 mages. The elf lowered his head and said that he was the one who gave the order to descend, and their deaths were on his conscience. He got up from the table and said that the war had just begun, but he had already done things, made choices for which he would never forgive himself. He, like her grandfather, out of his own selfishness, only wanted to keep her safe. Tesha raised an eyebrow when he said that no matter how valuable a contribution she might make to this battle, Varian looked at the swords and said that she was without a doubt a terrifyingly talented mage, and with the training she had received over the past 2 years, she would be a force to be reckoned with on the battlefield. But no matter how strong she was alone. He took the sword and said that just one mistake, one small miscalculation, and she would be gone, which is why he forbade her from participating in battle. He looked at her and said that he had forbade her until today. The elf frowned and asked, having seen only a small part of what she would have to endure, if she still had the desire to participate in this war. The girl nodded and confirmed. Grandfather tossed her the sword. She grabbed it. He told her to prove her resolve. They stood on the battlefield. Varian asked her if she understood the rules of battle. The girl nodded. He lunged towards her. Tesha dodged. She prepared to attack. The man dodged. He looked at her. Jumped back and landed. Grandfather attacked and she defended herself and retreated. The elf appeared behind him and prepared to attack. She struck, but he blocked it. Varian frowned. He grabbed her hand and threw her to the ground. The ground cracked. The vines lifted the girl into the air. Her eyes glowed green. The man slid away. He smiled and said that her control over her will and the beast had become much better. Kesha smiled. They attacked each other. The elf was wrapped in vines. She turned into a large ball. Suddenly it began to crack. The girl glowed. Varian looked at her in surprise. The ball exploded. The girl levitated. Swords appeared in her hands. She prepared to attack. Tesha flew at grandfather and told him to be careful. She struck. He blocked it. The girl parried something. She landed and slid away. Varian flew past her. They threw punches at each other. The girl successfully parried everything. They both got scratches. The man attacked again. The elf began to choke. She began to cast a spell. Grandfather kicked her in the chin. She fell. Tesha stood up and said that she lost, and even after all her training she could not land a clean blow. She frowned. Varian smiled and told her to call him not grandfather on the battlefield, but commander. The elf looked at him in surprise. She clenched her fist and asked if that meant anything. She beamed and began to thank him. Grandfather raised his finger and said that he had a few conditions. Tesha nodded in response to everything he said. That she needed to get her father's mother's consent. That she needed to understand the seriousness of her status. That her squad or battalion commander would take note of it. But it was up to her whether she would become a burden. That if her comrades felt that she was unable to take care of herself, he would immediately recall her from the battlefield. Varian poked her between the eyes. He frowned and told her to try to avoid situations in which she would have to use the second phase of transformation. She had not yet learned to control it properly, so in this form she was vulnerable. The girl remained silent. She waved his hand away and said that Master Alder had already told her about this. According to him, the beast whose will she possessed was somehow different from ordinary beasts, although he could not say exactly why. She turned around and said not to worry. She could avoid such a situation. She would go find her mother and father. Her grandfather called her. She turned around. He said that from this moment on he could no longer be her grandfather. The action and decision he had taken was only for her safety. He put his hand behind his back and said that from now on he had to treat her as such. Varian frowned and said that it did not matter who she received the order from, the general or him. She had to keep in mind that all orders would be given based on what was best for their future and not for her personal safety. He raised his eyebrows and said that this was his last warning. His granddaughter walked up to him. She hugged him and said that from now on he was her commander. She smiled. She put her hand to her head and said that she would be a soldier who would protect their country and its people. The grandfather also put his hand to his head and said that he knew. The girl left. He thought that was why he was afraid. The sun was shining. Varian was walking down the stairs. The door was open in front of him. Anna turned and called him. The girl bowed and said that she was not expecting guests. He said that everything was fine and he just came to visit. He looked at the one who was lying in bed and asked how she was. The girl replied that she had recently finished taking the necessary nutritional supplements for her body. She raised her eyebrows and said that her physical condition was normal, but no matter what they did, they could not wake her up. The elf folded his hands behind his back and asked if there were any changes. She replied that this was so. She would not disturb them. Asked him not to hurry. The man sat down on the chair. He looked in front of him and said that this was his old friend. He looked at Sylvie and asked what she was dreaming about. He said that he was not sure if she knew, but the Alakra army figured out how to build steamships and, most likely, were already using them to transport tens of thousands of soldiers to and from the shores. He said that he was sure that she did not know. After all, she had already been on this continent when they first started building the Dicotheus. He smiled and said that this was not what he wanted to tell her. She would not believe it. He raised his eyebrows and said that he had just sent his granddaughter off to war. I was sure she would be very surprised by such a decision. The old man laughed and said did she realize that he said he would treat her like a soldier and not like a granddaughter. That was a bitch, wasn't it? The elf looked forward and smiled. Varian folded his arms on the bed, said he was afraid. He said he knew how much she wanted to change something and be a part of this fight. He knew how stubborn she was. The old man rested his head on his hand and said that was why he had made the difficult decision. If she was going to fight in the war, at least she should be under his supervision. He bit his lip. He covered his eyes with his hand and said that it was hard for him. He became a king to avoid what he was doing now, but his actions had taken on a much larger scale. He said that even though Azura was there to look after his mental, emotional and physical state, he was still the commander-in-chief who gave orders to the spears and the guild leaders. He asked if it seemed stupid to want to sit in the garden and watch his granddaughter grow up, given what he had said. The elf asked what kind of stupid joke it was to send his own granddaughter to war. He said that the kings and queens of the elves and humans were doing everything they could to support him. The old man said that after all, since Alder had proclaimed him the only worthy leader of the Triple Alliance, they were all waiting for his orders. His hand shook. He said that he had already outlived his wife and did not want to outlive his children and granddaughter as well. He did not think he could bear it. The old man extended his hand. He took the woman's hand and said that he had not had time to apologize to her. Varian leaned over and said that he immediately felt that something was wrong. He asked if she knew that Lord Alder had not completely lifted the curse from her. He leaned over her bed and asked if she realized that she could die if she revealed information about the enemy. He felt it too but did not stop her. He shook and said that he had a chance to take a higher position in this war and for that he allowed her to fall into this state. The elf clenched his teeth and said that he will never forgive you for this. He should not have allowed this. He remembered the time when they were young. The old man said after everything they had been through together. He wiped away his tears and said that although there were those who, having learned that she was a spy, began to avoid her. But he would never do such a thing. She made her choice and went against her people. This decision shows how strong her will is. Varian took her hand and said that the real war will begin soon. For some time he will not be able to visit her. He stood up and said that after the war he promised to do his best to wake her up. He told her to rest for now. The monster was cut in half. The leader yelled for Darvish to switch positions with Standard. The guys smiled. He was fighting off the monsters and told her to be careful. If she died because of them, her grandfather would finish them off. Vines appeared from the ground. They immobilized the monster. Tesha smiled and asked if she should list all the times she saved their asses. The first flew. Kuria punched the monster and told her comrade not to start a fight he can't win. The monsters were advancing on their squad. Darvish turned to the guy and asked if he could find any packs in the LC. These gorillas just keep popping out of nowhere. Standard took aim and said no, not yet. The girl punched the monster and said she thought they should retreat. There were too many monsters for one team. Tesha looked at her and said that she was right. They came here to scout the area. She ran in the other direction and told them to retreat. The blonde cut the monsters and said that those lucky ones were now sitting quietly behind the front line and casting their spells in between chatter. His comrade left. The guy looked at them and said that it was humiliating. Tesha prepared to attack and told him to hit with all his might. She would hold them back. Standard frowned and shouted for everyone to move to the sides. The elf sent Ivy along the ground. It tied the monsters. They were immobilized. The guy switched something, aimed, and sent a charge. There was an explosion. The squad waited for the smoke to clear. Darvish breathed a sigh of relief. He looked at the blonde and asked if it was another double spell. He confirmed, saying that the recoil was slightly painful. Kuria looked at him and said that was why she wanted him to train with her more. He said he wouldn't train with her. She was a fierce little bomb. Tesha exhaled and told them to be quiet. Save their jokes. Fire won't hold off monsters for long. Darvish ran forward and shouted that it was time for dinner. Standard gritted his teeth and said that he was looking forward to another opportunity to enjoy the stale mush that the local chefs called food. The guy pressed himself against the elf and asked if their esteemed leader, who was also a princess, could get some real food for his team. The girl squeezed between them and told the guy to back off. She stuck her tongue out at him and said that if he was going to beg for something, he should cover his face first. The guy crossed his arms over his chest and said that he shouldn't be despised for his beauty and called her short. The girl said that she was not short, just small, and cute too. She pressed herself against the elf and asked if that was true. Standard pushed his friend's hand away when he said that he was small and could easily pass for a 10-year-old. He asked why he was constantly dragging him into their arguments. Tesha looked at them and said that they were in a dungeon, covered in blood, sweat and dirt. You can't look at them all without tears now. They went to the doors and knocked. The girl said that she was sure that a good shower would fix their situation. The guard looked at the arrivals. The doors began to open. The squad went inside the camp. There were many tents in it. The elf turned and told the team to go wash up. She was drying her hair with a towel. The team was already sitting by the fire. They were laughing. She remembered their first day. She smiled and thought that in 3 months they had covered a huge distance. She turned around when someone called her. Helen waved her hand. The girls hugged. Tesha turned to the team and said that she wanted to introduce them to everyone. Darvis flew up to Angela and said that it was nice to meet her. He fixed his hair and introduced himself as the 4th and most charming son of the famous Claral clan. Kuria added that he was also the laziest, spoiled and arrogant. Darvis was the 4th and most handsome son of the respected Claral house, but he didn't just get cocky for no reason. Helen looked at the girl and said that she must be Radev. She confirmed and asked how she knew. Kuria smiled sheepishly when the huntress said that considering the Radev family had served the Claral family for generations and her impeccable mana control covering her entire body, it was obvious. Tesha thought that the Radev family was famous for their unique gauntlet fighting technique and the Claral family for their axe. This also applies to the girl whose parents were never able to have a son. Darvis, who was thrown out of the house by his father and sent to war as soon as his son reached the yellow stage, and Kuria, whose conservative parents raised her as a son all her life, made a great couple. And yet, despite his rough nature, Darvis is only interested in 2 things, flirting with all the women and looking after his childhood friend. Kuria was as free as he was, maybe even strong, however, despite her harsh upbringing. She was bright and optimistic, so she became the key link that held their team together. The girl attacked a friend. He said maybe it was enough to run to violence and called her an evil little mouse. Helen said that they were just like Arthur and Tesha. Her whole team laughed. Stannard was wiping his gun. Durden approached him and asked what kind of crossbow it was. He had never seen anything like it. Arthur almost dropped the weapon from his hands and said that he had to create it taking into account his deviant abilities. The elf smiled and said that he could store ready-made spells in this weapon in the form of beast cores. Everyone looked at him in surprise. Adam said that it sounded expensive. Tesha remembered how Stannard made a good impression during the assessment. Professor Gideon personally introduced him to her grandfather. He is a dark yellow stage magic caster with an affinity for 2 elements, wind and fire, however. Due to the lack of mana in his core, he could not store the standard amount of mana for his level. And yet, Stannard proved that his peculiar useful deviant powers made up for it. Her team was the youngest among those stationed here and they fight in these dungeons every day for their country. She is very proud of it. They were able to show themselves well and there are no units that do well here, so although she was glad to see them, she couldn't help but ask. The girl looked at the dark-haired girl and asked what brought them here. She frowned and said that they had just returned from the wall. She looked at the princess and said that despite the situation there, they were sent here to help reconnaissance and better prepare her for what would happen. Stannard frowned and asked what they saw there. Everyone became gloomy. Tesha frowned and asked, did they really fight with Alacrian mages? Helen frowned and said that they had been at the wall for about 4 months. The wall is a kind of base, however. Battles are taking place throughout the animal fields. She looked at the elf and said that the main problem is not the mages, but the animals. Angela frowned and said that was why the commanders sent them here. In this cave there was a mutated S-class beast that was under the control of the enemy. She said that with this mutant, they were able to control hundreds or even thousands of normal monsters. Everyone looked at the blonde as she said that they had to find and destroy it before the enemy used it to destroy the wall. Tesha thought that the mutants were corrupted mana beasts that were susceptible to enemy control, mostly representatives of the dungeon. Using them they could control hundreds of other beasts that were originally under their control. She thought that as long as these mutants existed, the rest of the beasts of the same species would follow and fight with them. There were about a dozen squads trying to find and exterminate the mutants before the enemy could use them and advance towards the wall. The dungeon that her team was assigned to turned out to be the home of the S-class mutant. Defeating it was a strategically important task. Tesha frowned and asked the adventurer to tell her more about the battle at the wall. Adam clicked his tongue. He stepped forward and told the princess that this was not some fairy tale her nanny had read to her while she lay peacefully in her canopy bed. He raised his hand and said that this was war, people were dying, and if they were lucky there would be casualties on both sides. The elf looked at him and said that she understood what war meant and that she was asking because after defeating the monster their team would be sent straight to the battlefield and she wanted to at least prepare a little. They glared at each other. Angela took her hand and said that she thought it was time for them to set up camp, let them take their time, and they would have dinner ready for their return. Durnan looked at her and said not to take Adam's words to heart. The battlefield had been harder than they had expected and he wanted you to know all about it. Helen looked down and said that they were fighting monsters here, but the enemy soldiers were far more terrifying than any beast that lived here. The beast in action was predictable, they only killed to survive, and in some ways it was merciful. Stannard looked at her and asked what she meant by that. Jasmine looked at them and said that in war, information was the most important thing. Each side was trying to beat information out of the other. She frowned and said that the main way was to take prisoners and torture them. Everyone lowered their heads when she said that fighting here, it was easy to divide the sides into black and white, the beasts were bad, and they were good. She said that fighting with other people who spoke the same way, screamed in pain and begged for mercy, you stopped distinguishing the line. She said that the world turned gray and it became difficult to distinguish right from wrong. Everyone was silent, the princess swallowed, she looked up and wanted to ask something. Everyone turned around when someone screamed. The knight was holding the wounded man and asked for a doctor. Helen turned to the elf and asked if this happened often. She frowned and said not often. In a military hospital, Drogo turned around and asked the princess what was wrong if she was hurt. Helen waved at him. They shook hands and the girl said she was glad to see him. Should she call him leader? He replied that she was much better suited for that role. The man raised an eyebrow. He asked what brought them here if everything was all right. Alberta raised an eyebrow and said that the princess probably wanted to know the news brought by their sleeping prince. She replied that she could not hide anything from her. The old woman laughed and asked if this modest field hospital looked like a place for gossip. She called Stannard over and asked him to help her carry the herbs. Helen raised her hand and said that they did not want to disturb her. She was ordered to periodically report the situation to her superiors at the wall. She thought that the fastest way to find out everything was to talk to this man. Drogo folded his arms and said that she had made the right decision, but unfortunately it might take a while to get answers from him. Everyone approached the patient's bed. Alberta said that he was dehydrated and in a complete period of languor. Apparently he had not eaten or drunk anything for several days. She bandaged the wounds and said that judging by the state of his feet, he had been running for quite some time without stopping. Drogo looked at him and asked why. The man's hand moved. Sayre jumped. Everyone looked at him with concern. The man asked how long he had been unconscious. They told him about 10 minutes. The old woman handed him a glass and said before we talk, he needs to drink. He took a sip. Drogo frowned and said that he understood that he had just woken up, but they needed to know what had happened, where the rest of the team was. Sayre clutched the sheet. He lowered his head and said that they were all dead. Everyone looked at him tensely as he said that he was the only one who survived. He remembered how he had argued with the team members and left them. He said that he realized that he was wrong and that he couldn't abandon them, so almost as soon as they left, he followed them. He said that when he caught up with them, they were already being attacked by beasts and they were much deadlier than the ones we met here. There must have been about 100 of them, and some were even armed with their weapons. The monster killed one of the people. It was holding a human knife in its hands. Footsteps were heard behind the man. The monster was approaching him. He covered his mouth and said that he was lucky. The monster passed by. He said that he had to hide for several days before he managed to set up the teleportation gate. He grabbed himself with his hands and said that he couldn't risk activating it so that the beasts wouldn't destroy it before they could use it, so he ran away. Drogo frowned and asked if he really meant that when he said he had set up a teleportation gate. Sayer looked at him and said that there was a huge door behind them. It was like they were protecting something that was behind it. He thought they had found him. Everyone looked at him when he said that they had found the lair of the S-class mutants. Standard fiddled with his rifle, thinking that the beasts they had dealt with before were nothing compared to what they would encounter when they passed through the gate. He pulled the weapon closer to him and timidly said that he had 25 weak projectiles and 8 that contained powerful spells, so maybe he should prepare another 5 weak projectiles and 2 powerful projectiles, or he should lighten the load. The girl approached him. The guy looked up at her in fear. Korea said that the guy was thinking too loudly. She extended her hand to him with a smile and said that he should warm up, otherwise he might twist his ankle during the battle. The guy looked into her eyes. He took her hand and agreed with her. Arthur looked at the group and asked them to pay attention. The guys listened to him silently. The man ordered them to get ready because they were about to go further and they did not have exact information about the number of mana beasts located on the other side. The group looked at Tesha. The girl called the guys. She looked back at them and said that they would definitely survive, and after all that they would all have an incredibly delicious dinner together. The guys frowned with confidence and agreed with her words. The man waved his hand and ordered the vanguard to move forward. The guys rushed forward. The guy turned around tensely. A battle was taking place around him. The monsters grabbed the girl by the neck with incredible force. Blood gushed from her mouth. Garvis prepared to attack and rushed at them. He lunged and decapitated one of the monsters, and the girl fell from their clutches. Korea touched her neck and said that she was already dead. The squad continued to fight the monsters, recoiled in fear. Suddenly, he turned to the side, hearing a warning about the attack, fired a rifle, shooting a monster in the chest. Korea ran towards him. He aimed at the approaching opponents and said that he was reloading. The girl prepared for the attack and screamed loudly. She attacked the monsters, smashing their heads. Garvis turned to the blonde and said that the time had come to prove that he was not useless. Arthur teased him in response. The girl turned to her allies. The monsters continued to advance towards them. She asked if anyone could help her. Stannard dropped to the ground and fired. Garvis threw his axe. Their attacks killed one enemy each. The girl raised her fist back, preparing for battle. Thorny roots sprouted from the ground. They intertwined with each other, chipping the monsters. Tesha, embraced by vines from the aura, headed into battle. She flew between the monsters at high speed, decapitating them, and said that they needed to be gathered together. The guy looked back at her and said that he understood the idea. He ran an axe along the ground. Garvis ran around the chain monsters at high speed, raising dust and fire in the air. The guys began to create stone structures with the help of magic. A high wall surrounded the monsters. The commander ordered the guys to act at that moment. A whirlwind of fire and wind descended on the opponents. The monster ran out of the dusty haze. The guys began to attack the structures inside which the magical whirlwind was swirling. The girl continued the battle, making her way next to the vines. Garvis and Korea destroyed the monsters blow after blow. The commander waved his hand and said that everything was going well and that they needed to finish off the rest. Arthur loaded his gun. He took aim and energy began to gather in front of the rifle barrel. The mages fired a volley of spells of different elements. The man led the remaining army, ordering that a corridor be created for the sniper. Arthur took careful aim. A giant sphere of energy appeared in front of him. The guy fired, hitting his allies and rock fragments on the sides. The powerful projectile was approaching the crowd of monsters. It crashed into them, splitting the ground under their feet. The next second, a powerful explosion thundered in the cave. The man looked closely into the smoke. The cloud began to dissipate. There was no one at the place of impact. The guys began to rejoice. The commander ordered the healer to go forward and the survivors to help the wounded get to the healers, and those unable to fight return to the camp. The guys raised the blonde to his feet. The guy said that it was not bad. Suddenly the commander called out to the soldiers. He stood on the platform, stretched his hand above his head and said that despite the sudden attack of the Beast Man and their army, it was a stunning success, so they will continue the offensive. The death of their comrades will not be in vain. Looked down and said that the man called it a stunning success. Suddenly he noticed a covered body on a stretcher. He watched the people carrying the dead and wondered if this could be considered a victory, if for some people the significance of one life is something more than just the number of casualties. Then he looked at the princess and thought that about a dozen had already died, they still had not reached the lair. The elf looked thoughtfully ahead. Arthur wondered how many more people would die. Arthur raised his hand, giving a speech. The blonde thought that in a few minutes Drogo rushed through the entire cave announcing the discovery of a scout. 100 soldiers began to scurry around it, preparing for the upcoming battle because in the 3 months that they had already spent there, he had managed to do a lot. The girls were sitting by the supplies, preparing for the upcoming. Kuria was stretching her joints, Darbus was wiping his axes. The blonde turned to the elf and thought that judging by how his allies were trembling, he could tell that they were a little nervous. But Tesha, the girl who took hold of the hilt of the sword, thought that despite the fact that she was younger than them, the girl still remained focused and confident. The princess took hold of her hair. The blonde blushed embarrassingly and thought that he should control himself. He awkwardly turned away, the girl turned her attention to him, the guy thought that she was out of his league, and especially she was in love with Arthur. People gathered in small groups. The girl looked at the wounded, Standard looked at her. The healer was healing his wounds. The princess turned to him, hearing the question of what was wrong. She exhaled and said that it was great that they won, but they had already lost 10 soldiers. Darbus hit her on the shoulder and said that their always compassionate princess exudes kindness and care to them peasants. The girl asked him to shut up. Kuria took her hand. She smiled and said that everyone tried their best and won. The blonde stood up and added that she was right. He smiled and said that they knew that every time they entered the battle, they took a risk, it was impossible to save everyone. Alas, the princess smiled and agreed with his words, then said that he could not save everyone. The guy raised his hands and stepped back a little, then said that he did not mean that. The princess exhaled and said that at this rate she would never reach the level of her idol. Kuria leaned towards her and asked if she understood correctly that by idol she meant the guy she always talked about. Darbus was dissatisfied and said that he did not want to hear it again. He closed his eyes and added that the girl always talks about him as an all-powerful, humanly charming, handsome man who has no minuses, so he will never believe that this assessment is unbiased. Kuria mockingly laughed at him and said that he is just jealous, because Arthur has everything that he would like to have. He scowled angrily from his pitiful varnish. The princess said that Arthur was quite popular at school. Although she doubted that he himself realized it, the girl said that the guy was probably also handsome. Darbus ordered her to take back her words. The princess exhaled heavily and said that Arthur looked a little scary when they first met. Kuria stopped the fighting boy and said that, according to the princess's stories, Arthur saved her from slavers when she tried to run away from home. Tesha remembered their first meeting and said that it was true, and to be honest, now it seems that he did not do it from the heart but followed some kind of plan. Darbus stuck out his tongue in displeasure. Kuria folded her arms and happily said that he looked like a bad boy. Darbus raised his hand, closed his eyes and said that he did not think he was that cool, and that he was talking about the fact that after the kidnapping during the attack on the academy, the guy did not even make sure that she was safe but just ran away. The girl frowned and said that the guy asked her grandfather about it, because he did not have much time. Standard hit him on the shoulder. Darbus mockingly said something about secret training. Kuria looked at him with displeasure. The guy said that his opinion is that Arthur ran away from the war because he is afraid of dying. Kuria said that this is too much. The princess sternly said that he was wrong. The guys looked at her. The girl added that sometimes her comrade may not understand something or act naively, but he is not one of those who run away from battles and fear. She frowned slightly and added that his desire to protect the people dear to him is too strong. Darbus turned away and agreed with this discontentedly. The guys looked after him. The princess grinned. The blonde said that the guy could not be that strong. The girl answered that it was all true. Kuria approached her with a smile and asked if she would introduce them. Because she already wanted to meet him, the princess agreed to this. She folded her arms and said that she hoped that they would meet soon. The group continued moving through the cave. The leader frowned sternly. The princess looked ahead. The squad members began to look around. Darbus frowned slightly and said that it looked like some kind of terrible trap. The blonde agreed with him. There was a completely dark passage in front of the group. The commander gestured to the team with his hand. He turned to the guys and whispered that they would soon reach the place where their scout and his team were ambushed. He put the torch in front of him and added that according to the information, they would have to meet at least 100 gnolls and orcs, and they were bigger and more dangerous than those they had met before. The guys were confident but frowned. The leader ordered them to be ready for anything. The team prepared for battle. The man wished them strength and luck. The warriors rushed forward. Suddenly the man stopped. He looked around in surprise. I don't understand what was going on. The blonde looked in front of him in shock. A handful of monster corpses lay in front of the team. The guys were scared but recoiled. Darbus looked around and said that he didn't even know whether to relax or be afraid. The commander gritted his teeth. He raised the blade up and ordered them to approach the door. The team gathered at the giant gate. Tesha took up the sword and said that the team should maintain formation. Suddenly she raised her eyebrows in surprise. One of the team members put his hand on the door and said that it was not completely closed. Suddenly the group was seized with fear. The commander put his weapon in front of him and ordered to open the door. The soldiers rested their hands on the gate. The doors began to open slowly. Standard prepared for battle. A huge mountain of corpses piled on top of each other lay behind the gate. Dark blood flowed down to the guys' feet. The team was frightened and recoiled. They looked at the view that opened up in shock. Tesha lowered her weapon. She took a couple of steps forward. The girl stopped at the entrance to the room. She looked up in surprise. On top of the piled corpses was a silhouette of a man. Arthur looked at the guys emotionlessly. The princess frowned slightly and asked if it was him. The guys exchanged glances. The soldiers prepared for battle, hearing a squeak. Sylvie jumped to the girl. She rested her paws on her chest with a smile. The princess recognized her. The animal crawled onto Tesha's shoulder. The commander held his sword out in front of him and asked if the princess was okay. The girl replied that the animal was friendly. The man looked up and asked Arthur who he was, then demanded that he state his name. Arthur stood up. He jumped down to the guys. The group prepared for battle. The leader frowned angrily, looking at Arthur. Arthur with a calm expression replied that he was their ally. Helen and Jasmine stepped forward, recognizing Arthur. Standard watched them go and thought that this was Arthur the princess had talked about so much. He frowned tensely, looking at the girl. Tesha watched Arthur with a sad expression. Arthur wondered if she was happy to see him. Arthur looked away. The commander said that he did not want to worry them, but they had urgent matters that needed to be resolved. Arthur tilted his head and said that he was sure that no one knew of his existence, since he had arrived there less than an hour ago, and he was also sure that he should not have appeared in the middle of a huge flock of mana beasts. The man looked at him suspiciously and asked if he meant to say that he had single-handedly killed all the beasts in that pile, including the high-class mutant. Arthur asked him if he saw anyone else. Arthur looked around the team. The soldiers began to quietly talk among themselves, not believing what was said. The blonde raised his eyebrows and asked what happened to the cores of all those beasts. Arthur pointed at his pet and said that she really liked to eat them. The animal scratched itself. The man asked in disbelief if she really ate all the cores. Suddenly, Sylvie noticed something. The monster came at Arthur from behind, growling loudly. The princess staggered forward in fear. The next second, Arthur cut the monster's face. The monster's head fell in front of the team. Arthur lowered the sword and said that he must have missed one, after which he added that if they wanted to question him in more detail, then first he wanted to have a little snack and wash up. The princess looked at the leader, touched his chest and said that the twins and she herself would vouch for him and make sure that he was delivered back without problems. Helen smiled and said that he was their old friend. Arthur smiled slightly. He looked at the princess and thanked her with a smile. On the way to the base, Arthur was smilingly discussing something with his comrades. Tesha thought that she did not doubt at all that her childhood friend was in front of her, but there was still some anxiety in her chest. Darvis frowned with displeasure. Kuria looked after the guy with admiration. The princess added that years had passed since their last meeting, and she imagined their reunion somehow differently, but she could definitely say that everyone was alarmed by his sudden appearance. The blonde looked at the satisfied Tesha. The people returned to the camp. Arthur and the princess sat down next to each other at the table. She thought that the guy clearly kept a lot of secrets. Helen and Drogo were discussing something. The girl added that, as it seemed to her, the guy was only giving out necessary information. The leader frowned angrily. The princess thought that he was not satisfied, but now he had enough information to plan the next steps. Jasmine looked back at them as they left the tent and said that they could rest for a while. The princess looked at the guy tensely. She grabbed her pants. The girl blushed embarrassingly and pursed her lip. Arthur smiled softly, looked at her and said that they had not seen each other for a long time and that he missed her. Tessa turned to him with tears in her eyes. She jumped on his neck, hugged him and called him an idiot. The guy hugged her back. The girl said that she missed him too. She looked at his face and puffed out her cheeks in displeasure. The young man stroked her and said that she was still the same crybaby. Tessa turned away with displeasure and told him to shut up, after which she added that a lot had changed. The guy said that he would take this into account. He put his head on his hand, smiled and asked to tell her how she was doing, because he wanted to know about everything. Stannard looked at the closed tent. Darvish grabbed his head and said that this was something disappointing. Korea glowed with admiration. She said that this day was full of events, and she was not sure that even if they gathered all their troops, they would be able to avoid huge losses. The guy exclaimed with displeasure that this was impossible and this kid was there alone. Korea smiled mockingly. Darvish turned away from her and wondered how the guy was able to kill everyone. If he really did it himself, the girl said that she felt notes of jealousy. The blonde corrected her and said that she was talking about envy. He closed his eyes. The guys looked at him with displeasure. Arthur said that jealousy is a feeling that arises when a person is worried that they will take away what they already have, and envy when a person does not have it. The guy got up from his seat, took this field and said that he understood what to do. He adjusted his equipment, smiled and said that he would challenge Arthur to a duel. The guys sadly asked him not to do this. The girl put her hand on her belt and asked him why he takes everything to heart, because Arthur is only one person, and no matter how strong he is, no one can win this war alone. The guy put his weapons behind his back and said that he does not need her pity, because this guy is natural, after which he found fault with Arthur's manner of speech. The blonde looked at him. The guy frowned angrily. Arthur said that everyone treats him the same way. Darvish asked him why he took the stranger aside. Stannard lowered his head, grabbed the bridge of his nose and said that there were no sides, because it was naive to form an opinion about a stranger without even talking to him. The guys looked at each other and frowned deeply. Arthur added that the princess always spoke well of him, so these words could have some basis. Darvish said that the princess's mind was clouded by childhood memories. He smiled ominously and said that maybe the blonde would finally have a chance with the princess. Arthur clenched his teeth angrily. He poked the guy in the chest. Darvish grabbed him by the collar. They began to quarrel loudly among themselves. The girl tried to stop them. The guys looked at each other in rage. The guy said that the blonde probably had a complex because of the deformed mana core. At least he doesn't show off when he sees someone clearly superior to his level, just so as not to infringe on his devalued pride. Darvish gritted his teeth. He squeezed collar tighter. He let go of his clothes, turned away and said that he was right and that he was becoming just like his father. The girl said discontentedly that at least he understood that. Darvish and Stannard turned around at the princess's voice. Tessa and Arthur came out of the tent. Darvish smiled and said that the situations were still different. He walked towards Arthur. With a calm expression on his face, he addressed the guests, pointed at himself and introduced himself, after which he challenged Arthur to a duel. Arthur stood opposite each other. The crowd around supported their ally. Helen and Jasmine silently watched what was happening. Tessa held Sylvie in her arms. The opponents exchanged glances. Arthur looked into Arthur's eyes and said that although it was late, he was interested in what the specific reason for the duel was. The young man frowned and said that it was about male pride. The commander spread his arms out to the sides and said that before they began, they would discuss the conditions of the duel again, which required the use of mana strictly for strengthening the body, and the first one to give up or no longer be able to fight would lose. Arthur folded his hands in agreement. The man thought that his Darvish was quite skilled, but the guest would definitely resist. Darvish prepared for battle. The man waved his hand and finished the thought by saying that he was interested to see if their guest was as strong as they said. Darvish pushed off the ground with incredible force. He made a quick dash, finding himself behind his opponent. Arthur turned around and looked at him ominously. The guy frowned in surprise. He pushed off the ground with his toe. The youth looked at the back of his opponent. The guys standing nearby booed Darvish. The guy angrily shut them up. Korea and Standard exchanged glances. The blonde looked at his ally and thought about how he had witnessed Arthur's merciless massacre of a high-class monster and saw how he defeated adventurers of the same rank twice his size with a smile. A drop of sweat was running down his chin. The blonde added that now he could not believe what he was seeing. Darvish frowned sternly. Arthur thought that even he could see how Arthur, who was eager for battle, became scared. He let out a loud scream. He made several blows, which the enemy easily dodged. He made a sweeping blow with an axe. Arthur took a step back. Darvish twisted his foot, standing on the ground. He turned around and made a second blow. Arthur ducked to the ground. Arthur jumped and swung, preparing to attack. Arthur restored his hand. He struck the enemy's solar plexus. Darvish grabbed the body, landed and thought that this guy's reaction speed was just insane. He hit the ground and launched a stone block. Arthur smashed it into pieces with one blow. The guy was behind him and was already attacking the enemy. Arthur moved to the side from the blow. Darvish frowned, noticing this. Suddenly, the enemy made a dash at incredible speed and attacked him from both sides at once. Darvish gritted his teeth in pain. Arthur rushed in front of him. The young man dealt the enemy several quick blows to the body. He suddenly stopped and stepped aside. Darvish staggered and dropped his axes. He tried to take a few steps, after which he fell to the ground. People did not understand what happened. Korea looked at this in surprise and said that this was a rupture of the mana flow. The blonde frowned and said that he had seen information about this in a book on the anatomy of water flows, but it said that it was necessary and the point. When strengthening the body, they are naturally protected. The girl added that they are also so small that during a battle it is almost impossible to hit them, especially at such a speed. Arthur approached the enemy and offered his help. The blonde smiled and said that he thought they had witnessed something amazing. The guy lying on the ground frowned and asked what was going on, why he could not move. Varian smiled widely and said that Arthur would be fine. Suddenly everyone turned to look at him. The princess turned to her grandfather and asked and they had ended up there. Arthur smiled happily, noticing them. The old man looked at the guy with a smile. The curtain of the tent shook slightly. Varian grabbed Arthur by the neck and began to pull his ear, asking him about why he did not inform about his return. Arthur said that he was glad to see his grandfather again. Alder took off his hood and greeted Arthur, saying that they both have changed a lot. Varian looked at him with a smile. Arthur replied that he really hoped so, then asked how they found out about his return so quickly. The old man replied that the Lord received a message from Winsome, and that's why they came. Tesha quickly looked out from behind Arthur. The Lord said that he was sent to the same place where the princess is, then asked about how Ren is doing. Arthur replied that he would surprise Tesha the next time they met. The girl hit him on the shoulder, smiled and said that the meeting was a much bigger surprise for them than with the high-class monster they were hunting. The guy replied that as soon as he appeared, a horde of beasts attacked him and Sylvie, and there was no time to even catch her breath. The girl smiled widely and asked if that meant he was telling the truth when he said he defeated them and how he was able to get in there. Varian stopped her and said that he and the guy had something urgent to discuss, so it wasn't the best time to ask. The girl asked if it was time to leave. Alder looked at her and said that it didn't concern her, because she would stay there. Arthur put his hand on her shoulder. The girl said that Arthur had come just a couple of hours ago, and they were already taking him away. The young man said that she wanted to ask them about many things. The old man addressed the princess by name. He crossed his arms and said that since the dungeon was already cleared, everyone would leave soon, and she was responsible for other battles, after which he added that she and her team would be busy so she should prepare them, remember what they agreed on. The girl lowered her gaze. She saluted her grandfather and repeated his words about making their way through battles using their strength. Varian looked at her face, confirmed this and repeated these words again. Alder opened the exit from the tent, addressed the girl and said that over the past months she had become stronger, and the battles she had gone through had tempered her. The old man said that they were leaving immediately, and the girl thanked her master. Arthur looked at her in surprise, thinking that he did not expect the Lord to take the girl under his wing. He left the tent. Arthur turned his attention to the people near the fire. The blondes suddenly noticed his gaze. The guy smiled and nodded to him. Stannard saluted him with a smile. Arthur walked on. The guys stopped arguing among themselves. The men approached the shining gates. The young man looked at his pet and asked how it happened that she did not talk to the princess. Sylvie answered that the lady must have her secrets. They approached the portal. Sylvie added that she wanted to surprise her the next time they met. The guy's leg appeared from the portal. He came out of the gate and looked away in surprise. The giant bear looked angrily into his eyes. A huge bear appeared in front of the main character. Ellie jumped out from behind Boo's head. The younger sister jumped on her brother. She hugged him tightly, greeting Arthur. Arthur hugged his sister with a smile, thanking her. The Lord and Varian watched Arthur as Arthur hugged his sister, pulling her cheek. Ellie said that there they were. She waved at her parents. Arthur turned his head away with a sad look. Alice extended her hand to her son. Arthur looked at his parents in surprise, who hugged him. Arthur was confused, saying that he did not understand anything. Alice closed her eyes and smiled. She said that the man she raised for a decade returned after years of training, adding that she thought it deserved a hug. Ray patted his son's head, saying that he was sure he had been through a lot there. The mother pouted in displeasure, saying that she had also invested too much in him. Arthur grinned sheepishly, saying that it was true and that they had both given him more than he deserved. Ellie grabbed her brother's hand. She looked at Arthur with a happy smile, asking if he wanted to ask her anything about Boo. Arthur smiled awkwardly, looking at the bear, asking that the giant's name was Boo. The bear put its paw on Arthur's shoulder with all its might. The ground cracked under Arthur's feet. Arthur stood motionless as Boo was shocked. The mage brushed the paw off his shoulder, telling Ellie that Boo had a temper. Ellie hugged the dejected bear. She said that Boo just wanted to see if he was as strong as she said, and he was just competing. Ray grinned slightly, proud of his daughter. Arthur asked Ellie that she could communicate with that beast and that she was connected to it. The younger sister said that she bet that was true. Alice said that at least they knew who she looked up to. Arthur looked at the old man in confusion, asking when this happened. Varian asked that Lord Winsome had not told them about this, noting that before leaving for Ephiatus, he had given the family a mana beast. Arthur pointed at Boo, looking displeased. He asked that Winsome had simply given that huge plush beast to his sister for her to ride during battles. Ellie jumped next to Boo. Ray said that when Winsome gave it to them, it was still small, but he must say, Boo had grown up quickly in 2 years. Arthur looked back at Alder. The Lord said that as much as he was touched by the family reunion, they would have to put it off until they had some discussions. Ray nodded his head at Arthur, hugging Alice. Arthur pressed his hand to his chest, bowing his head. Alder said that his family had been living there for a while, as he thought it would be better for him and he would meet them again. Arthur said that was correct, thanking him. Arthur patted his sister on the head, saying that he would talk to her soon. Arthur's family watched him leave. Arthur looked back with narrowed eyes. Boo patted Ellie on the head. Arthur grinned contentedly. He waved his hand at his family. Sylvie looked at Arthur with a smile, saying that she was glad that his sister would not be alone anymore. Arthur sat at the same table with the Lord and the old man. He asked why it was just them, no kings, queens, or spears. Arthur looked at Arthur with narrowed eyes. He said that he thought that at least he would meet the headmistress Sylvie. Alder nodded his head to the elder. Arian looked at Arthur with a serious look. He said that he had not yet encountered many of the circumstances caused by martial law. Arthur looked at the elder, dumbfounded. Arian said that at that moment, Sylvie, in order to cope with the effects of the curse, had entered a state of spontaneous sleep, which was activated after the information about the Alacrians was revealed. Arthur clenched his fist angrily. He exhaled heavily, leaning his elbows back in his chair, telling them to tell him everything. Arthur noted that he had bombarded the two commanders with his questions for hours, adding that he had gone 2 years without new information and Winsome and Wren had only told him what they thought he needed to know, but it was not enough for him. Arthur imagined an image of a king and queen. He noted that according to Varian, the Gladers had focused most of their efforts on the Dwarven Kingdom in hopes of regaining their loyalty. Arthur imagined Curtis and Caitlin destroying monsters. He noted that Curtis and Caitlin had done the same as Tesha, forming a team to gain real combat experience on the front lines. Arthur imagined how Vincent managed people. He noted that his family was in the castle for their safety, but the Halstia family was elsewhere and Vincent was using his resources to support the war. Arthur looked at the old man intently, asking if his parents had expressed a desire to participate in the war. Varian said that his father had, but he had told him to wait until he returned or until Ellie was a little older. Arthur sighed heavily, thanking the elder. He said that he couldn't imagine how it would feel to know that his father had gone to war and died in it when he hadn't even had a chance to participate. Arthur's mouth dropped open slightly. The Lord and the elder looked at Arthur. The mage said that now it was time to move on to the purpose of this meeting. The mage looked ahead with a serious look. He said that he knew they hadn't brought him there to reunite with his family, and that it was something serious enough to keep from his granddaughter or he would have told her back at the camp. Varian lowered his head, his brows furrowed. He said that Tesha was ambitious and trained hard. Arthur folded his arms, saying that he was still more worried about her safety than anything else, noting that he understood. Arthur turned his head towards the Lord. He told him to correct him if he was wrong, but apparently that battle was a concern for everyone on the front lines, and despite the defensive line on the wall preventing mutants and Alacrian soldiers from leaving the beast's glades, Alder closed his eyes and nodded his head. Arthur added that the hidden teleportation gates installed by the spies at Alacrian, as well as their control of the mana beasts, were a rather dangerous addition to the enemy's fighting power. Arthur narrowed his gaze, saying that it was too suspicious. Arthur continued to sit at the table. The mage said that the beast's glades would be an ideal base for them, considering that the SNSS-class mana beasts were under their control, but that was too blunt. The mage crossed his arms. He said that if they couldn't break through their defenses, then either they were too strong or they were just buying time. Varian looked down at the table thoughtfully. The mage looked at Arthur with a serious look. He told Varian that judging by his expression, he could definitely say that the latter was true. The elder looked away with a serious look. He said that evidence had recently come to light that confirmed their suspicions. Alder stood up from his chair, picking up a scroll. He told Arthur that he couldn't allow him to blame himself for what he was about to tell him. Alder spread the scroll with the blueprint on the table. The mage looked at it in horror. The Lord said it wasn't Dicotheus if that was what he was worried about. The Lord crossed his arms, saying it was a ship built by Alacrian, using his designs. The mage stared at the paper. He clutched it tightly in his hand. A worried fighter ran into the hall, calling out to the Lord and Varian. Varian looked at the fighter with a menacing look, asking what was going on. The guys stared at the fighter. The knight said that movement had been spotted and they were approaching the western shore. The knight trembled with fear, saying that they were there. Arthur's eyes widened in bewilderment. The knight noted that these were Alacrian ships. The chair crashed to the floor. Arthur abruptly rushed to the exit. He and Sylvie ran down the corridor. Sylvie looked at Arthur with concern. The mage rushed past the fighter, almost knocking him off his feet. Arthur ran up to the doors near which guards were standing. The guard looked at Arthur in bewilderment, asking him to state his name and purpose. The guard grabbed Arthur, stopping him. Arthur's feet slid across the floor. The fighter pushed Arthur away. The mage asked to open their gates. The guard put her hand in front of her. She said that all movements must be coordinated with either Commander Varian or Lord Alder, noting that they had not received any orders from them, so nothing would work. Arthur said that he had recently entered this castle with Varian and Alder, noting that they knew he had left, so he insisted that they let him through. The guard looked arrogantly at Arthur, noting that Commander Varian and Lord Alder. The guard added that no matter how arrogant the children of nobles were, they needed to learn to respect their elders. The guard looked at the guy with concern, saying that it was dangerous to go out alone at such a time. Arthur sighed heavily. The guard said that if he had a bodyguard, the fighters would grab their throats with their hands. Arthur gave off an intimidating aura, saying that it would be wise for them not to try to patronize him at the wrong time. Alder called out to Arthur. The mage looked behind him. The Lord walked up to the mage, placing a hand on his shoulder. He said that Arthur was free to leave if he wished, telling the mage not to act rashly, as he did not want the time Winsome had wasted to go to waste. Arthur looked at the Lord, nodding his head. The mage ran through the gate, shouting for them to set up the gate to travel to Addiston. Two black silhouettes stood near the headmistress. Sylvie was fast asleep, lying on the bed. The black silhouette said that it was imperative that she give them as much information as possible. The black silhouette stood opposite each other. The silhouette said that her knowledge could bring them victory, adding that she should think of the millions of lives she would save if she cooperated with them. The black silhouette smiled bloodthirsty, saying that it was okay if she died from the effects of the curse, adding that her mission would be over when they got the answers. Sylvie's eyes widened in horror, thinking that she was going to die. The headmistress stared at the ceiling in shock, saying that she thought Lord Alder had weakened the curse. Blurry silhouettes hovered in space. Clear weather stood above the meadows of flowers. Young Varian asked young Cynthia what she planned to do after the war was over. Varian smiled contentedly, saying that they had known each other for quite some time, and that they had been enemies for part of that time, and not for the other, but he had always had only one thing in mind. Cynthia smiled wickedly, asking what it was, his undying love for her. Varian waved his hand, smiling widely. He apologized, saying no, adding that she should not forget that he was married. He said that the nobles were not deterred by this. Varian said that they, the elves, were loyal. The brown-haired girl looked at the elf in surprise. The elf said that he kept thinking about what kind of teacher and role model she could become. The elf looked up at the sky with a smile, saying that he could easily imagine her as the head of some prestigious academy, leading the younger generation to a great future. The brown-haired girl said that this was somehow unexpected, asking what led him to such conclusions. A butterfly landed on the brown-haired girl's hand. The elf said many things, adding that she should seriously consider the teaching profession, noting that he was sure she would like it. The butterfly sat on the girl's finger. Sylvie looked at the butterfly flying away with a smile. She said that in that case, maybe she would open her own academy, noting that she liked the city of Xyrus. The girl put her hand on Varian's shoulder. Varian asked what the academy for mages was in the floating city, noting that he liked it. The girl asked if he wanted to be a co-founder then. Varian looked at the brown-haired girl in surprise. He laughed, clutching his stomach with his hand. Varian asked what they were going to call it, the Good Sky and Irelith Mage School. Varian wiped the tears from his eyes, declining the offer. He added that maybe when the time came, his grandchildren or great-grandchildren would study there, if it was good enough for them of course. Cynthia spread her arms out, saying that she would really do that, just let him wait and see. She added that the Xyrus Academy would be the greatest mage training facility the world had ever seen. Varian asked what the Xyrus Academy was in the city of Xyrus, noting that it was not very original. Varian nudged the girl with a smile. Cynthia said that she couldn't call it the Good Sky and Irelith School of Mages, adding that he could consider himself lucky if any of his descendants managed to enter her academy. Varian said that she understood that he was joking. The elf turned sharply to the girl. He raised his hand in front of himself, saying that then, he hoped for the success of the Xyrus Academy. Cynthia smiled sheepishly, saying that she hoped for it. The girl stared intently. Varian turned in the other direction. The girl watched as the elf walked in front of her. She extended her hand to him. The brown-haired girl looked at Varian in fear. Blood dripped in front of the girl's feet. The elf turned behind him, saying that he was the old man there, asking her not to fall behind. Sylvie looked at her bloody hand in horror. Varian woke up from his sleep, hearing a loud scream. The commander came out of the office as the soldiers ran down the hallway, asking what was going on. The old man looked at the guard with concern. The soldier said he wasn't sure, but apparently someone was screaming on the floor below them. The old man said there shouldn't be anyone there. The commander's eyes widened in horror, shouting Anna's name. Arthur ran to the gate. The soldier grabbed Arthur's hand, asking what he was doing there, and that he didn't know there was a state of emergency in the city. Arthur glared at the soldier, saying that the Varian commander had sent him. He snatched his hand, asking him to open the gate. The man looked away with displeasure, saying that yes, of course, the Varian commander had sent the skinny cutie, adding that if he was just a nobleman's son running away from home, then this was not the best time or place. Arthur closed his eyes and exhaled heavily. The fighters stared ahead in horror while the man kept his eyes closed. The man told Lester and Scram to take Arthur back as he didn't want civilians there. The guards looked up in shock. Arthur said that if they didn't open the gates, he would break them down. Arthur, riding Sylvie, flew out of the building. They soared high in the sky. Arthur stared ahead with a serious expression. Arthur gritted his teeth, remembering the image of Gideon. Sylvie landed on the ground. Arthur dismounted from the dragon. The mage walked up the snowy plain. He remembered the image of Varian, who told him that he couldn't blame himself. The commander and the fighters walked down the corridor. Varian told Arthur that no matter what happened, he had to move forward. The commander threw open the doors to the room. Varian told Arthur not to fight to fix the past. The old man looked at the mutilated body in horror. Varian told the mage to fight to create a better future. The old man fell to his knees. The mage thought that he had never seen himself as a righteous hero saving the world, and he had always fought only to protect those he cared about. The commander sat on the floor, opposite Sylvie's bed. He grabbed his face with his hands and screamed loudly. Arthur stared ahead. He thought that now, after everything that had happened, he had another reason. Arthur looked at the approaching ships, thinking that he could correct his mistakes. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button for more epic manhwa recaps.